Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the barbarians and missionaries who reached them in our continuing study of church history. In our timeline, we're still in the period of the ancient church, although we're going to be transitioning this time to look into the medieval church as well. Down the line, we'll eventually get to the Reformed church. That's the look at a whole glance of where we're headed in our timeline of church history. It was in the mid-300s that Attila the Hun, along with a great Hun migration, began from the steppes of Central Asia to move into Europe. The story is told that as he was getting ready to come down into Italy and threatening Rome, that Pope Leo went in to meet with Attila. They went into a tent by themselves. Nobody else was looking on. They were there for a time, and when Leo came out, he went his way, still in one piece, and Attila came out and said, guys, we're leaving. And they turned around and left Rome, did not attack Rome, which you can well imagine did nothing to impede the reputation of the Pope in that day and age. As the Huns, though, moved into Europe, other groups began to be displaced. The Goths in Central Europe found themselves moving in a variety of directions. One tribe, I'm going to describe them as such, maybe they didn't see themselves quite that way, but one tribe moves down into Spain. They became known as the Western Goths, or as we say, the Visigoths. Another group are going to move across the English Channel, and they will become the Angles and the Saxons, forerunners of our English heritage. Still another group of Visigoths are going to move across the Straits of Gibraltar and come into North Africa. They will be known as Vandals, and eventually they're going to cross Sicily and come into Italy from the south, where they will use their name upon the city of Rome. They will vandalize Rome, and that's where we get our term vandalize from. Still another group of Goths are going to be moving down into the east. We will know them as the Ostrogoths, or the Eastern Goths. One of the missionaries during this period is going to be Ulfilas, who will be a missionary to the Goths. He is going to approach them and translate the Bible into their language, so that now they will have the scriptures in their own language. Certainly we've heard of Patrick. St. Patrick has become a byword in our culture today. Patrick actually grew up in England in a Christian family, so he wasn't strictly speaking Irish, but he found himself captured and taken to Ireland by a group of Irish raiders. He became a slave for an unknown number of years. Eventually he either escaped or was released. We don't know the details, but he escaped to Europe, and he was ordained as a priest and a bishop, and eventually went back to Ireland, not this time as a slave, but this time as a missionary to bring the gospel to Ireland, and he met with wondrous success. He was the first to speak out unequivocally against slavery. Slavery had been a worldwide institution, and Patrick said it is not in keeping, it is not consistent with the truths of the Scripture and with the gospel of Jesus Christ. The slave trade under his ministry, that slave trade in Ireland at least, came to a virtual halt. And Ireland eventually, down the line, became a center of missionaries to England and to Scotland and even to the rest of continental Europe, as people began to forget their heritage, as Vikings and so on came into certain areas. It was the Irish who said, no, you need to remember that the original faith of this land was Christianity. Boniface, now we're moving several hundred years forward, is another missionary to the Germanic tribes in the north. The story goes that some of these tribes were worshiping Odin and Thor, and they were gathered around their sacred oak tree. They would do this in December as the sun went down earlier and earlier as they're getting close to the winter season, the winter solstice, and Boniface goes up, according to the story, I don't know if it's true or not, but he goes up with an axe and starts chopping down their sacred oak tree. And they're waiting for Thor or one of their gods to strike him dead, and nothing happens, and the tree goes crashing over. And then he turns and says, let me tell you about what God did on another tree, how Jesus came and died in our place, and we can trust in him. And he presented the gospel to the Germanic tribes up there. I'm not sure but that I would advocate his technique. That's probably not the best way for us to do it, but it was effective in his day. Now, Rome falls in 476 AD, although if you had been around the next day, Rome was still there. It hadn't disappeared or been wiped off the map. But from now on, it is going to be ruled by outsiders. There was a plaque near actually it's in the Colosseum. It says, while stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world. It must have been a frightening thing to realize that the Roman Empire as such had ceased to exist. Now, remember there had been that split between the East and the West, and so the eastern part of the empire is going to continue for the next 1,000 years. Justinian is one of those emperors in the East. He would have considered himself a Roman Empire, although he's ruling from Constantinople. He comes to the throne in 527 and had taken a bride, Theodora. She was actually an actress, and that was considered somewhat scandalous. But she was well up to the task, because once he was on the throne, there were some riots at a local. You know how you read sometimes these days about riots at a soccer match. Back then, it was riots at a chariot race, and the Blues versus the Greens, and they got into it. And it was so hazardous that the king and his retinue were considering abandoning the city. And Theodora said, queens do not abandon cities. Queens do not run away. If we're killed by the mob, then that's a good death. And he said, well, maybe we ought to stay. And he took the plans of one of his youngest generals, a general by the name of Belisarius, and he managed to win the day. The Nike riots came to a halt, and Justinian was firmly placed upon the throne as a result. And so over the next number of years, he sends out mostly Belisarius. There are other generals too involved in this, but Belisarius seems to have been his ace in the hole, as it were. And Belisarius retakes Italy, North Africa, and even parts of Spain, where once again the Mediterranean, at least for a time, becomes a Roman lake. He also sets out to build the Hagia Sophia, this wonderful, it's not just, you can hardly call it just a church, this is a basilica. It represents the kingdom of God on earth. It was many years in the building, and Justinian is quoted as saying, when he first saw the completed structure, "I have outdone you, O Solomon." The Hagia Sophia, in many years later, would eventually be taken by the Muslims after the fall of Istanbul in 1453. And would eventually become a Muslim mosque. Today, it serves as something of a museum, which means that outsiders like myself, non-Muslims, are still permitted to go in and to see this great structure that is still standing today. Now, in Justinian's day, the empire was weakened because he had gotten into some wars with Persia, and even though he didn't really totally win against Persia, but he didn't totally lose. It was sort of a stalemate, and yet plague ravaged Europe during this time, and as a result, it has been estimated that 1 out of every 5 people died. A huge loss of life. Now, Justinian is followed a bit later by Phocas, a Roman centurion who murdered, he didn't murder Justinian, he murdered one of the later emperors, and it's a measure of the weakness of the Byzantine Empire that the Persian Shah takes this opportunity to invade and marches to the very walls of Constantinople. And focus passes from the scene, and it looks like Constantinople and the Eastern Empire is about to fall from the scene as well. It is in this time that a new emperor arises, Heraclius, and he leaves Constantinople in the hands of the patriarch of the city. That is, the chief bishop is left in charge of the city, and in a daring move, he invades Persia. He just leaves the Persians at the doorstep, goes around behind them, and invades the Persian Empire so that the Shah is forced to retreat. And he retakes all the lands that had been taken by the Persians and brings about a wonderful victory. But all of these battles, again, continue to weaken not just the Byzantine Empire, but the Persians as well, so that both nations, both empires, both kingdoms are greatly weakened. It's on the heels of this that we have the rise from the Arabian lands to the south, the rise of Muhammad. This is a man who claims to have a revelation from God. He is a monotheist, and the people of Arabia were largely polytheists at this time, and so he's doing something that's new and unique. He's saying, no, there's only one God. Of course, Christians have been saying that all along. His teachings are known as Islam, which means submission, and the idea is you had to submit to him or else. The writings, and he becomes also his religion becomes a religion of the book. This was rather rare in the ancient world. You had the Jews who had their sacred book, the scriptures. You had the Christians who had their sacred book, which included the Jewish scriptures, but then also the New Testament. And now you have the Quran, the collected recitations of Muhammad and others. In 622, he moves to Medina, and this marks the time when he begins to gain in power and authority. And eventually he conquers Mecca in 630, and that will be the way by which this new religion spreads. It will spread largely through conquest. Major contrast with the way Christianity had spread. Remember, Christianity did not spread by the sword. It spread throughout the Roman Empire while it was still, we could describe it, a underdog religion. It was not in power, and yet it spread throughout. By contrast, Islam is going to spread largely by the sword. So that over the next number of years, from Mecca, it will go out. And Muslims, as they conquer Christian territories, will place restrictions on both Christians and Jews. Both Christians and Jews are required to wear a special mark on their clothing. There is no proselytizing permitted. If you're Muslim, you can proselytize all you want. If you're a Christian or a Jew, you cannot tell anybody else about Jesus in such a way that they might hear and believe. No new churches or synagogues are allowed to be rebuilt. Those that are still standing are allowed to remain. No new churches. No church bells could be rung. And involvement in politics by Christians or Jews is going to be limited. This new religion goes to the very borders of Constantinople. It goes in and takes Persia by storm. It moves all throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and it moves across North Africa, up across the Straits of Gibraltar, through Spain. Spain becomes a Muslim land, and all the way into France, stopping a mere 100 miles from Paris. It will be at the Battle of Tours that Charles Martel, that's a nickname, Charles the Hammer, it means, in 732 will meet the Muslims at the Battle of Tours, and the advance stops here. They are driven back across the Pyrenees. In fact, it's a grandson of Charles Martel, Charlemagne, who is crowned by the Pope in the year 800 A.D. As the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which really isn't all that holy, and it's may have something to do with Italy, but it's not really Roman. And to be quite frank, it's not an empire either. But he's crowned as emperor of a united Central Europe. And Charlemagne, the word Charlemagne just means Charles the Great, except we're saying it in French. He promotes schools, he promotes learning. It is said that he would go to bed with a little writing tablet where he was practicing his ABCs. However, his kingdom is divided at his death, and it will be divided among his sons. Instead of one son being the king, there will be several sons that each reigning over a province. However, the idea of a Holy Roman Empire will continue. Now in 1054 we have a division between East and West, not a political division, well it's going to be political too, but a division of the church, where the church at Rome versus the church at Constantinople, each will divide one from the other. The Pope at Rome will excommunicate the Archbishop of Constantinople and all of his followers, which means that entire church is excommunicated by Rome, and the favor will be returned by the Archbishop of Constantinople. What were the issues? You have to understand what had taken place far earlier. These two churches were considered, the major churches of the ancient world. The Council of Constantinople in Canon 3 had stated that the Bishop of Constantinople shall have the primacy after the Bishop of Rome, because his city is the new Rome. And so these two were considered the two power brokers within the church. Why did the church split? There were a number of factors involved. The West Church versus the East Church, and remember this schism takes place in 1054. In the West Church, there was the idea that the church is over the state. In the East Church, the state is over the church. You have Constantine and all of the other kings of the Byzantine Empire. They're the ones in charge. In the Western Church, you did not have that central authority. And so the church was seen to be, it was argued at least, that it was over the state. In the Western Church, the Pope is the final authority. In the Eastern Church, the Church Council has the final authority.